Hi guys, I want to take a few minutes here and try and dispel a myth that I see guys talk about all the time, especially two-stroke saw builders. You hear people talk about saws sucking in air. There's not an engine out there that sucks in air. All engines rely on atmospheric pressure to force air into the engine. The piston moving up and down is just increasing and decreasing volume in the cylinder or in the crankcase as a two-stroke is concerned. So, in a little test you can do to understand this a little bit better is to put a vacuum gauge on any type of engine. Doesn't matter what it is. Depending on your elevation, it's going to read, 30 inches of vacuum, on a V8 that's at sea level. The second you open the throttle, that needle goes straight to zero and isn't coming back until the throttle's closed or you're cruising down the road at moderate load, moderate throttle. If the engine was sucking in air, you should still have some kind of vacuum. If the engine was actually able to suck in air more than the atmospheric pressure, you would have a little bit of vacuum on that gauge still, but you don't. Anyway, so at sea level, atmospheric pressure is like 14.69 or 96, something like that. Basically 14.7 psi, pounds per square inch. At my elevation, I'm around 12.6 because I'm pretty high up, just shy of 5,000 feet. So anyway, if a saw or if an engine could suck in air, it would make, say an engine could suck in a given amount of air. It would build the same amount of power no matter what the elevation was. But as you move up in elevation, there's less air above us pushing down. Like, okay, the air is just a giant ocean above us, okay? Let's think about it like this. Like you take something to the bottom of the sea floor and that has less pressure than the pressure of the water above you, and you open it, what's going to happen? Is it flooding in or is it sucking it in? Okay? Well, it's flooding it in because the pressure is so much greater on the outside of your container or whatever that it's flooding in. The air is the same way. As you move up in elevation, there's less air above us pushing down, and so as you move up, you lose power because you can't get as much air into the engine. So you'll hear guys talk about, and this is something that I see all the time. Guys talk about having enough time for your intake. As the piston comes up, it needs to have so much time to create suction before the window opens on your cylinder. Well, that's not really true. That's not true at all, because Reed style two strokes, they put their intakes right into the case, and as soon as that piston starts going up, it is pulling in air. It's not pulling in air. What it's doing is it's increasing the volume in the crankcase where the pressure is less than atmospheric pressure, and so the atmosphere pushes the reeds open and into the crankcase. And then when the piston changes direction and comes down, the pressure in the crankcase increases, closes the reeds off, compresses that charge in the crankcase, and drives it up through into the transfers. So it does not matter, even on a piston ported two-stroke, you could have that intake right at the bottom of the piston skirt on bottom dead center, and it will fill that case entirely. Problem is as the piston comes down, it can't compress that air until that window closes. That's why when you drop your cylinder or you take a bunch off of the bottom of your intake, you run the risk of getting a saw that's hard to tune, sluggish off idle, doesn't like to idle, because at that low RPM, it's not creating enough pressure to drive that air up into the top of the cylinder. It has nothing to do with sucking in air, and it's something that just drives me nuts when I hear people say engines suck in air. It doesn't. They just don't. And it ain't like I made this stuff up. There's information about this all over out there. And so, but as you think about engine air coming in and it's not being pulled in, you're not sucking it in, you're relying on atmospheric pressure to push it in. That should kind of make you think about your intake track and what's going on in there and how much time you have to get the air in, and then squeeze it and drive it up into the top of the cylinder and all that. It should make you realize that your intake track is very, very, very important on having a nice, smooth, straight shot into your crankcase. Huskies, one of my biggest gripes about them is their intake horn and having that immediate 90. That is the worst thing for performance probably ever on a chainsaw. But anyway, a saw is nothing more than, any engine is nothing more than pressure differentials throughout the air track that makes the world go round, okay? But the really important thing to think about is when you're considering intake time is how far can you go with it and still be able to close that window off in time and compress that air enough to drive it to where it needs to go. Now, if you don't have a lot of area, okay, which is one place that these X-Torques really fall apart on, is they don't have a lot of area, meaning opening size, to let that air flood in. They're very choked down. So when you don't have a lot of area, you have to have more time. You have to give it time for that air to be able to come in. With longer time, you decrease the amount of time you have to be able to compress the charge in the bottom end. So it's a fine line there of, and you'll know, like if you've gone too far with your intake, you'll start getting spit back into the intake track, and your saw is going to be a little tricky to tune. May not always idle right, and especially if you change elevation a lot, you're going to constantly be tuning with it. And so and the other thing to think about too is you're trying to get as much air to flood into the crankcase as possible, but you also have to be able to close it off and not push that air that you've got in there back out. So dropping the cylinder 40 thousandths can be kind of tricky. I know there's guys who do it and they seem to run okay on video, but you know, like I change elevation a lot. I go from 7,500 feet down to like 4,000 feet in elevation. And if you've got an intake that is closing too late, it is not going, like at 7,000 feet, it's going to run like a freaking turd. It is not going to like that long intake time. And so that's why guys epoxy the floors and will raise the roof on their intake if they drop 40 thousandths or so. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work, but I think that on most saws that's a very extreme way to go, and they make it work because they're cutting 40 off the base, cutting 40 out of the band, and they're ending up with a really wide band and a really small combustion chamber. Okay, so they're still making power, but it's more because they've got such a small combustion chamber now, and they're not really feeding it any more air. And they're probably actually feeding it less air than what they would if they just drop it a little bit. Because I drop my cylinders too, but I just don't drop them quite to the extreme some guys do. And also, in my opinion, they're giving up power with that really wide squish band and a really small combustion chamber, especially where they don't break the lip or the abrupt edge where it goes from squish band into combustion chamber. If they would knock that edge off, and give it a roll to go into the combustion chamber, would help a bunch too. And it would make a lot less volatile conditions inside the cylinder, because with that sharp edge, it has a really good chance of pre-detonation. My theory is less squish area gives less opportunity for fuel to be trapped and stay unburned in that area. I want to try and drive as much air into the cylinder as I possibly can. That everything from the intake to the cylinder is the most important part when you're trying to build power in a two-stroke, especially a chainsaw. So they don't have a pipe, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to get into about the differences between snowmobiles, dirt bikes, two-strokes like that run reeds versus piston ported two-strokes. So it's a fine line of trying to. That's why, you're better off to widen your intake out than increase duration. Most chainsaws have pretty good duration right out of the box. You really don't need to be taking much. And I just, if you're cutting the base and dropping 40 thousandths and not filling that intake back in, I don't know, I've never got to run one that was set up that way, but I would think if you're having major elevation changes, that saw is not going to always perform well, and you're going to be tuning with it a lot. But anyway, this is kind of a ramble on deal, and I mainly just wanted to get guys to think about air pressure and how it affects engine performance. Like I said, whether it's a single piston, 42 pistons, it doesn't matter. You're relying on atmospheric pressure to get the air into the saw. They do not suck. I can't put any more air in this little saw than a 4-inch bore inside of my Chevy pickup. Like, it's only going to take what atmospheric pressure will give it. It cannot suck in any extra. So just some things to think about. I'm going to end this off here. I think I've rattled on quite a bit. If there's any questions, or you guys want to maybe know or pick my brain on something I didn't cover here, or whatever, if you have questions, leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. If you think I'm wrong, that's cool. I'm willing to have a discussion. But it's things to think about, and this information is out there. You can do a quick Google search and there will be all kinds of stuff to tell you that engines do not suck air. It is more about compressing the air that is in the crankcase and getting it to where it needs to go. So just keep that in mind when you're working on your intakes and things like that. And just remember, if you don't have area, you have to give it time. And with time, time in one direction, you lose in another when it comes to chainsaws. So keep that in mind. Everything's a give and take, and it's a lot of it's trial and error, and I understand certain things work for some folks and certain things work for other folks. This is my opinion on it as a guy who's been working on engines since I could hold a wrench, pretty much. And this was taught to me by a guy who's forgot more about engines than I will ever know. So take that for what it's worth to you, and thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, I'll catch you guys on the next one.